My daughter has done nothing but disappoint me." The words dropped like a hammer in the middle of the hall. Heads turned. Conversations died. My father's voice didn't need to rise. It carried the way authority does when it's been practiced for a lifetime. He wasn't correcting me. He wasn't guiding me. He was branding me. And he did it in front of everyone. Neighbors, relatives, veterans who'd fought beside him. He placed his hand on the shoulder of a younger man, a Navy SEAL he called his protégé, and declared him the son he wished he'd had. The room swallowed me in silence. I am Theodora Pruitt, and in that moment, with my father's public rejection burning through my chest, I understood that the wound between us wasn't just old, it was still wide open. The air inside the old naval hall was thick with heat and the smell of fried chicken drifting from folding tables along the wall. Folding chairs groaned under the weight of aging veterans in pressed khaki. Women waved paper fans in front of their faces, and kids darted between legs with cups of lemonade. It was the kind of small-town gathering where everyone knew the order of things, where tradition carried more weight than surprise. My father, Frank Pruitt, rose to the stage with the slow authority of a man who had been saluted his whole life. His shoulders squared as if the uniform were still on him, though tonight he wore a blazer that seemed more like a medal than clothing. The chatter died the moment he cleared his throat. He didn't have to raise his voice. Command clung to him like a second skin. Then, with the precision of a blade, he let the words drop. "All she's ever done is disappoint me." The sentence cracked through the hall like gunfire. Conversations froze. A fork clinked against a plate and went still. Every head turned, and for a second I felt the floor tilt beneath me. My face didn't move, but inside my chest, something caved. He didn't stop there. My father turned, rested his heavy hand on the shoulder of the young man standing beside him, a broad-shouldered Navy SEAL in crisp dress blues, the kind of man whose posture carried its own applause. His name was Cole Mercer. My father's voice swelled with pride as he announced, "This is the son I never had." Murmurs of approval rippled through the room. People nodded, admiring Cole, their respect sliding away from me and toward the man my father chose to elevate. But then it happened. Cole's eyes found mine across the hall. The easy confidence drained from his face. His jaw slackened. And in a voice low but sharp enough for every ear nearby to catch, he whispered, "Black Widow?" The word cut through the silence, heavy with something no one else in the room understood. The veterans shifted uncomfortably. A few younger men stiffened, as if the name carried its own kind of gravity. My father's smirk faltered, confusion flashing across his eyes. The hall went utterly still. Respect, suspicion, curiosity. They all collided at once as every gaze locked on me. The silence roared louder than applause, and in that suspended moment, I felt the story I had carried in shadows begin to break into the light. The house where I grew up was small, wooden, and always smelled of black coffee and shoe polish. That was my father's scent, discipline brewed into the walls. From the time I was 8, he would line me up in the kitchen like a cadet, heels together, shoulders back, eyes locked forward. "Don't blink," he'd say, watching me until my lashes burned. My bedroom was no refuge. Every Saturday morning, he inspected it like a barracks. Sheets had to be pulled drum-tight, shoes lined in a perfect 45-degree angle. If there was dust on the windowsill, I cleaned until the cloth came away black. When I brought home a ribbon from track or aced a chemistry exam, he dismissed it with the same flat response. "Don't get smug." The truth was simpler and crueler. In his eyes, the failure had happened the day I was born. He wanted a son. He got me. And every day after was just proof of the disappointment he claimed I embodied. My mother carried the softness he refused to show. She tucked slips of paper into my lunch bag, lines of Dickinson, Frost, Hughes, reminders that there were other kinds of strength. "One day," she'd whisper when he wasn't listening, "you'll fly." When I was 17, I filled out my application to the Naval Academy. I'd left it on the kitchen table, still smelling of ink. My father found it first. Without a word, he ripped it in half, then into quarters, until the pieces littered the linoleum like fallen leaves. He dropped them in the trash and walked away as though he'd just corrected an error in formation. But my mother had already made a copy. Quietly, behind his back. She mailed it in. Months later, long after I had given up hope, a thick envelope arrived in the mailbox. I opened it in the dark of my room, clutching the words against my chest, as though they might vanish if I let go. My dream hadn't survived because of him. It had survived because of her. Annapolis stripped away any illusions. The mornings smelled of chlorine and cut grass. The nights of sweat and metal bunks. My hair was shorn. My voice trained into sharp answers. Yes, sir. No, ma'am. Precision was survival. I wasn't there to become a frontline warrior. My place was in intelligence and operations, in building the scaffolding of missions others would run. I learned to hear what most people missed, the shift in a voice over radio, the breath that carried fear, the silence that warned louder than sound. At Coronado, the Pacific spat salt into our mouths as men ran with logs on their shoulders. I ran beside them when I could, not to prove I was one of them, but to prove I could keep pace. Respect didn't come easy, but eventually it came, because my plans worked, because when chaos broke loose, my contingencies held. The first real test came on a mission in Africa. A supply truck blew a tire on gravel. Gunfire cracked out of nowhere, and in an instant the entire plan threatened to collapse. Radios hissed, men shouted. I shifted routes, adjusted timing, recalculated exits. The net held. Every man came back alive. Later, in the heat of the debrief, someone sketched a crude red spider on the corner of the map, a joke at first, then a name, Black Widow. It stuck. Not because I killed, but because I spun webs, plans that caught what others never saw coming. That night, I realized the nickname wasn't about venom. It was about survival, about weaving threads strong enough to carry the weight of men's lives. And that, more than any medal, was enough. The first letters I mailed home carried the dust of foreign soil and the sting of sea salt from bases far away. Inside one envelope, I'd slipped a photo of myself in uniform. The bars on my collar still new, my face too young for the weight I carried. Weeks later, the letter came back, unopened. The paper creased from travel, but untouched by his hands. Back in town, whenever someone asked about me, my father shifted the conversation to weather or crops, as if the mention of my name were an inconvenience. He let people believe I was tucked away behind a desk somewhere, shuffling papers no one would ever read. The truth was harsher. He made sure they believed it. My mother was the only line that stayed alive. She called once a week, her voice soft over crackling connections. She never asked about missions, never wanted details I couldn't give. Instead, she asked, "Are you eating? Are you sleeping? Do you have somewhere to pray?" It was her way of keeping me tethered, even across oceans. Then came the day cancer hollowed her out. At the funeral, the church was heavy with lilies and the hush of old neighbors. My father stood by the window, eyes on the parking lot, folding and refolding the program until the paper frayed at the edges. He didn't look at me. He didn't touch my hand. His silence said more than words ever could. Even in death, he would not close the distance. I watched him from across the room and knew the truth with a clarity that seared. No matter what I had done, no matter how far I had come, I had never been and would never be enough for him. In Bahrain, the air itself felt like fire. My office was nothing more than a narrow room with radios stacked high, maps tacked to the wall, and sweat dripping from every beam. Still, it was where the threads came together, where I learned to hear patterns no one else could. Word spread quickly through the teams. "She hears when the web shakes," the men would say, half joking, half believing. The nickname carried weight long before anyone said it to my face. I added a new line to every mission checklist. Who calls home if things go wrong? It was a detail no one wanted to write down, but everyone needed. Soon, before every departure, men would knock twice on the table, a small ritual that became a superstition, then a bond. One night, A young operator approached my desk. His name was Cole. His face still carried the wide-eyed sharpness of someone untested. He cleared his throat and asked quietly, "Ma'am, did you see that coming?" I looked up from the radio log. "I saw what could," I told him. He nodded, the kind of nod that plants itself deep, a truth he would carry long after that night. What he never knew, and what my father would never care to know, was that the mission he walked away from that week had nearly collapsed. My adjustments, my web, had kept it intact. Cole lived because of it. After my mother's funeral, as neighbors whispered condolences, one old veteran leaned close to me and said, "They call you Black Widow, don't they?" The words drifted across the room. My father heard them. He stiffened, then turned his head, choosing once again to ignore what was right in front of him. In that moment, I understood the split in my life. Out there, in sand and salt and smoke, my name was whispered with respect. At home, I remained only what he had always decided I was, a disappointment. After years away, I drove back into the Florida Panhandle. The old Naval Hall had been dressed for ceremony, flags hanging high, tables covered in white cloth, pies lined in neat rows beside sweating pitchers of lemonade. I had mailed my father an invitation, though he never replied. Still, there he was, walking to the stage in his worn suit as though the hall still belonged to him. He gripped the microphone and introduced Cole Mercer, a young SEAL, his hand firm on the man's shoulder. "The son I never had," he declared, pride swelling in his voice. Then he turned toward me, cutting me down with words that sliced sharper than any blade. "All she's ever done is disappoint me." Cole's head snapped toward me, his face paling. His whisper carried further than he meant. "Black Widow?" The entire room heard. My father chuckled, desperate to recover. "She just pushes papers, nothing more." He waited for laughter. None came. The silence grew heavy. Eyes shifted. Doubt spread. For the first time, the room wasn't entirely his. The air thickened, the fans turning lazily overhead while whispers slid like currents through the hall. Cole drew himself upright, voice steady and strong. "With respect, sir, she doesn't file. She saves lives." He told them about the night the convoy's tire blew, gunfire erupting from the dark, the team seconds from ruin, until my plan rerouted them to safety. Veterans nodded. The younger ones stared wide-eyed, and the room slowly reshaped its vision of me. Near the back, a boy leaned into his father's side, whispering, "She's real." The words spread like fire in dry grass. A veteran pressed a hand to his chest and rose, then another, then more. One by one, they stood, not clapping, not cheering, just silent and solemn, a gesture more powerful than applause. My father's eyes flickered, his jaw tight. The command he had once owned in this hall slipped away. For the first time, he faltered. The hall had fallen into a silence so deep I could hear the whir of the ceiling fans cutting the heavy air. Rows of people stood shoulder to shoulder, their chairs pushed back, their eyes locked on me. Behind my father, the American flag stirred faintly in the draft, its edges trembling as if it, too, was waiting. I stepped forward, each sound of my shoes against the floor echoing louder than words. My father's posture remained upright, but I could see the tightness in his jaw, the way his eyes flickered to the crowd instead of meeting mine. For a man who had commanded rooms his entire life, he suddenly looked cornered. I stopped a few feet from him, standing where the weight of every gaze converged. My voice didn't need to rise. It carried on its own, sharp and steady. Respect isn't inherited. It's earned. Sometimes in silence, sometimes in rooms like this. The words landed like stone. Not a single breath dared to break the moment. The stillness deepened, pressing into every corner of the hall. For once, I wasn't the daughter being dismissed or the woman overlooked in favor of someone else's uniform. I was the one defining the ground beneath us. My father shifted, shoulders rigid, his smirk long gone. The crowd, who once would have laughed at his side, remained utterly unmoved. No applause, No cheers, just the weight of people rising together, holding their silence like a vow. In that hush, something irrevocable shifted. The veterans who had saluted him for decades now turned their eyes to me. The neighbors who once pitied me now measured me differently. Even the children stood still, wide-eyed, as if they had witnessed history tilt. And in the center of it all, my father seemed smaller than I had ever seen him. Not a commander, not the man who could silence a room with his presence, just a figure overshadowed by the truth he could no longer bend. The silence was no longer his weapon. It was mine. The hall itself had chosen, and for the first time in my life, I stood taller than the man who had tried to break me. The house looked smaller than I remembered, its paint weathered, the porch sagging under years of heat and storms. Inside, nothing had changed. The smell of coffee and old wood lingered, as if time itself had been ordered to stand at attention. I sat across from my father at the same kitchen table, where I had once been drilled to keep my back straight and my eyes forward. The scarred wood still bore the dark stain of a burn I'd made as a teenager. When I set down a pot too hot, he had lectured me for an hour that day. The mark had never faded. Now, his hand rested there, trembling, tracing the outline of that old blemish like a man searching for something he had lost. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, not the sharp silence of discipline, but the heavy silence of years wasted. Then his voice broke it, softer, thinner than I'd ever heard it. "I didn't know," he said slowly, eyes fixed on the table. "I expected a son. That was foolish." The words landed with a weight I had been waiting my whole life to hear. Not an apology, not even close, but the closest he could come to one. I drew in a breath, steady, even. "I didn't need a son to carry your name," I told him. "I carried my own." The truth lay between us, sharp and undeniable. There were no tears, no sudden embrace, just the plain reality spoken aloud after decades of silence. It was enough. He let out a long, uneven sigh, his shoulders slumping as if the burden of all those unspoken years had finally cracked through. His chin dipped, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked small, just a man, no longer a commander, no longer an unshakable wall of authority. His lips parted, and the word came out rough, unpolished, as if it had never been shaped in his mouth before. Proud. One word, nothing else. But it stripped him bare, left him not as the figure who had ruled my childhood with drills and silence, but as a man, flawed, diminished, and finally honest. And that, more than any salute or parade, was the recognition I had never thought I would hear. Part 7, Chapter 10. At my mother's grave. The cemetery lay quiet beneath the spread of old oaks, their branches whispering in the warm breath of late afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, gold and soft, painting the headstones in a glow that made the silence feel almost merciful. I walked the narrow path until I reached her stone, worn smooth by rain and time. I rested my palm against the cool granite, feeling the rough edges beneath my fingers. My voice came out low, meant only for her. "We're learning, slow, but true." The breeze stirred just then, threading through the trees, and for an instant I swore I could hear her voice folded into the wind, gentle, steady, carrying the words she'd given me at the very end. "Don't run away. Rise above." I closed my eyes and let the air move through me, not fighting it, not grasping at it, just receiving it. When I stepped back, I felt no need for anger, no hunger for triumph. Peace was quieter than I'd imagined. I left the cemetery with the weight finally shifted. What mattered wasn't my father's collapse, or his pride spoken too late. It wasn't the whispers that had carried through the hall. It was that the truth had stood, steady and unshaken, in front of those who needed to see it. The community, Cole. And even my father, though reluctantly, had been forced to face it. That was enough. The story didn't end with his downfall. It ended with my own standing, unbroken, in the place where she'd once told me I would fly.